Good morning and welcome to WNHH FM's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Well, some people who make New Haven and Hamden tick have been busy in recent days watching New Hampshire tick. I'm speaking of local journalists who have made the trek to our neighbor to the north, the quadrennial spectacle known as the First of the Nation Presidential Primary Nominating Contest. One of those reporters is New Haven Independent Sam Gerwitt. He's making his third trip, scrambling among different campaigns today in New Hampshire. We're hoping he's going to call in. That's not 100% certain. He's trying to get situated at a political rally and then call in. So we may hear from Sam. But we were definitely going to hear from Lucy Gelman of New Haven Arts and Tom Breen of New Haven Independent. They spent the weekend reporting in New Hampshire. You've read their stories in New Haven Independent, New Haven Arts, and they're back home now in the WNH studio to see us what they saw and heard this time and last time. Good morning, Tom. Good morning, Lucy.
Good morning.
It is great to be here. We remembered to return the rental car this morning.
You did.
So we are officially over with our weekend marathon trip to the Granite States. We're awake.
Even though did you eat poutine?
We did. The problem of being vegetarians in New Hampshire is that there are not a lot of poutine.
Wait, I learned from your article what poutine is. Amy Klobuchar was in the diner. She ate poutine because you're supposed to eat like the local stuff. And she mentioned she hadn't eaten all morning. There's this theme with, I don't know if it's sex or not, this theme with Amy Klobuchar and eating throughout her whole campaign. But anyway, French fries, cheese curds, and the gravy. So is the gravy not vegetarian?
It's usually a beef-based gravy, and it's very similar to the Minnesota hot dish that Amy Klobuchar has talked a lot about.
And what's in Minnesota hot dish?
Tater tots.
Mm-hmm.
I know that tater tots feature prominently.
Those. Yeah.
And then there's some like meat, and then there's cheese. It is meant to get you through a Minnesota winter, which lasts from like September through April.
So New Hampshire prides itself on being almost like the caricature of the type of retail politics that maybe Bill Clinton perfected, and that in the run up to the primary, which is this Tuesday, candidates try to barnstorm diners in Manchester and Concord, usually around the kind of central and southern end of the state. And Klobuchar, who is having a bit of a clementum right now, or we'll talk about the different words for it. We followed her to a diner on the west side of town called Chez Vachon, where she engaged in that very
Are they French Canadians?
There are a lot of French Canadians in New Hampshire, and indeed poutine is of French Canadian provenance. But she had a kindergartner sit on her lap and put some poutine in her mouth and made herself off as a
I was actually impressed that she was talking to that
figure.
kindergartner about Chicka Chicka Boom Boom and kindergarten teachers. I got the sense she could talk to a 6-year-old.
Yeah. I think she can. I do want to go back to the Amy Klobuchar and eating, but
tell me what you think about that.
Oh, I actually, so that is what Amy is not my gospel. But I actually think that the whole like women on the campaign trail and eating is really interesting, and there are these undertones that are complicated and very sexist. And if we go back to 2016, Hillary, there were all of these campaign stops that Hillary made where she just didn't eat anything, or she had like a coffee or a tea. I remember one very politicized one where she was with other candidates.
And it's Bill who came to eat the pizza in New Haven, remember?
Yeah.
I will say my favorite presidential candidate eating anecdote is when Bernie Sanders was interviewed by the New York Times for these kind of puff piece candidate interviews months ago, maybe a year ago. Right. And they asked him what his campaign junk food was. And his only response was, when I was campaigning in California in 2016, I put on a lot of weight. And that's all he said.
Yeah.
Well, I had a lot of questions I wanted to ask you, Lucy and Tom, about what you saw in New Hampshire. Yes. But Lucy said something from in the air that I'm really trying to think about that's really interesting. So you covered a lot of the 2016 campaign here and on the road, and you went to the big Bernie Sanders rally that was on the Green, biggest political rally in 36 years at the time in New Haven. It was translated into no votes because he lost New Haven pretty soundly. Another issue. But you were talking about how technology continues to evolve in politics. So by 2016, when you went to a rock concert or club, people always had their cell phones up in ways they didn't when I was a kid. People were recording things. But I got the sense that you were seeing another evolution, another iteration of the role citizen technology is playing. Did I hear you right, or what were you up to there?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think at the events that we went to, so we were there for a limited period of time, just 2 days. But at the events we went to, so we went to a candidate forum actually where technology was pretty controlled because it was hosted by MSNBC. And that was interesting.
That was a Saturday morning one about justice, right? With all the candidates.
The courts and reproductive justice that became, so Tom wrote a fantastic article on how the candidates are looking at the structure of the courts, and specifically the Supreme Court, but also the appellate courts, which I feel like are often forgotten.
I learned a lot of new things in that article,
Mm-hmm.
one of which I never knew, which Bernie Sanders was saying that just because you're appointed to the Supreme Court doesn't mean they have to keep you on the Supreme Court. They can rotate you to, like they do in Connecticut, actually. Luby Harper spent some time in the Supreme Court. How does that work? Is it the president decides, hey, Kavanaugh, you're now going to be in the Nebraska court? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it was a fascinating forum, and one that, again, it was sponsored by NARAL Pro-Choice America, by the Center for Reproductive Rights, and I went in really thinking that it was going to be almost exclusively about women's access to abortion and healthcare. But it wound up, a lot of candidates spent a lot of time talking about structural reform to the courts, with many Democrats seeing the Supreme Court in particular as completely controlled by right-wing ideologues, and the success of the Federal Society pushing all of these, very conservative justices into every level of federal court. So from Pete Buttigieg to Bernie Sanders to Amy Klobuchar to Andrew Yang, they all spoke about how to not just appoint new progressive justices, but change the structure of it. And indeed, as you said, Bernie Sanders, one of his structural reform suggestions, he wasn't going as far as Pete Buttigieg and packing the courts, adding more justices.
He actually said that FDR made a mistake.
Exactly.
Doing that.
He did not want to touch that. But he did say that, some legal scholars think that it would, be constitutionally allowable to rotate federal justices between the Supreme Court, the appellate court, the circuit court, that you can still have lifetime appointments, and yet you don't have to be tied down to any one individual.
But who would decide that? Who rotates them?
It sounds like it could be the president, but that level of detail, I
and then
do
you
not
have
know.
to talk about the separation of the branches of government. So, Lucy, what did you notice different about? Because then you went to a rally, a Momish rally at University of New Hampshire. Was it?
Well, before that, so we when Amy was eating poutine, that was at Chez Vachon. And that was also interesting because everyone got their phones out, and some of the diners had known, they had heard that Klobuchar was coming, and they stuck it out because she was actually about 2 hours and 20 minutes late. And they just said, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to sit and nurse our coffees, and the diner filled up, which was kind of fun to watch. But then everyone whips their phones out, and then at the rally, everyone had a phone, and we were because of who Tom and I had both been interviewing before the rally. We were sort of away from the press area, which was actually great. It was preferable for photos, but everyone had a phone up. And what I found was I was using a zoom lens, and I was shooting through people's heads. People were packed in very, very tightly, probably not up to fire code. And then also through people's cameras or phone cameras, and people were Facebook Living, but they were also using the video recording, which I actually think speaks to maybe Klobuchar's demographic. It's a little bit older. Not everyone is using Facebook Live. No one, I think, was using Instagram. Maybe one or two people were using Instagram.
So video, could one argue, and remember, this is way beyond my knowledge base. You're watching this stuff. So everyone was using phones 2016, maybe not as much in our everyday life. Is video and Facebook Live, we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement how important video became.
Yeah.
Is there more video recording, whether it's the older people without the Facebook Live function or the younger people with Instagram? Is video now, citizen video, more of a reality on the campaign trail? And what does that mean for candidates being heard and bypassing gatekeepers in the mainstream media?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, when we were at this diner, Chez Vachon, with Amy Klobuchar, her press person, a little controlling with us, but very, very, trying to make it as easy as possible for the, traditional TV news cameras to get their shots of Amy Klobuchar. There's still, I think, a press kind of relations apparatus in place for that campaign that we saw that really wanted to make sure that
really care about TV. And Amy is
really
more
wanted to make sure that she got
into
it,
an old paradigm of politics from Walter Mondale's day that whatever ideology you kind of wish existed but doesn't anymore, like from the West Wing, the kind of bipartisanship and the responsible and moderate stuff. Yeah.
And I think that this is a moment, right before the New Hampshire primary, especially in such a wide and fractured Democratic field. Mm-hmm. A lot of candidates, including Klobuchar, who kind of second or third tier right now, see incredible value in getting as much media exposure as possible. That includes TV news. However,
and of course, the people who were the surprise bypassed that. So Yang was getting no mainstream coverage, and it was all because of podcasts. Now, Lucy, let's talk about that.
Yeah,
because
sure.
the podcasts have exploded since 2016. We had podcasts. You did one of them. But in fact, in America, that was like minuscule. It's now like, the exclamation point in math, the factorial. That's like what has happened with podcasts. It's gone to infinity. And
Totally.
they say that that Yang really became a national candidate and raised millions of dollars in debates because of podcasts. Joe Rogan. We saw that Bernie bizarrely had Facebook propel in 2016, even though it isn't used with those long screeds on Marxism that got all those reads more than Hillary and everyone else combined. And now he also is being embraced by podcasts. How much is alternative media drawing candidacy? Does it depend on the candidate? Maybe Amy needs that mainstream TV in a way that a Yang or someone who has sort of a grassrootsy, genuinity, outsider vibe can harness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question in that it also speaks to candidates who sort of, I think even as Amy was trying to figure out, okay, who's my base and how many of New Hampshire's independents can I snag? So I think 42% of registered voters in New Hampshire are registered,
and they're
as
allowed to vote in the
independent.
primary?
Correct.
Yeah, it's an open primary.
It's an open
Ooh,
primary.
that is really
And
interesting.
so she really was pitching to the middle.
Right.
I think that Amy Klobuchar and some of the other candidates have thought, okay, if they're in my base, they're not considering Bernie. They might be considering Pete, although she did come out swinging against Bernie Sanders a little bit yesterday.
But that's part of position herself
Yeah.
as I'm against radicals.
So
Yes.
I think, yes, definitely the alternative news media and the smaller news media play a role. It's at the same time as, podcasts are exploding, but small local news outlets, I think, across the country are also struggling. We've seen some really exciting case studies in online journalism. And Paul, you could speak to that much better than I could. But at the same time, there are newsrooms that are closing. And so all of a sudden you've got massive news corporations that are kind of grabbing one story or two stories.
Yeah, but I see my argument. I guess I'm an outlier in this. I think that all those local newsrooms wrote the same story because they were all owned by the same big companies, and that there's no comparison now to the number of independent news outlets, individuals on Facebook with 10,000, 100,000 followers,
and Medium,
people on Instagram, podcast, newsrooms like ours. I think that in the old days, you actually had a much greater hold on a narrower outlet for people, for candidates, and I think this is a golden age.
Yeah, the Columbia Journalism Review newsletter this morning spoke about how the four kind of leading Democratic candidates, Sanders, Warren, Buttigieg, and Biden, all went on the Sunday talk shows and how rare it was for all those candidates to do it. And they focused in particular on how Sanders was incredibly skeptical of the mainstream media in 2016, still today, but even more so in 2016, and how he kind of created his own alternative media outlet where he has his own podcast called Hear the Burn. He would not do interviews. He would kind of create this whole media culture around his outsider campaign. And I think that when we saw Andrew Yang speak, he quoted Joe Rogan. Like these are the kinds of people who some of these outsider candidates feel like it's better for them to mention than it is to.
Right, it's going to be interesting to watch
ABC.
what happens on Tuesday because Amy got the Manchester Union leader endorsement. Right, I would argue that probably doesn't matter at all, but let's see.
Yeah.
Right.
The New York Times could have mattered if they endorsed her rather than her and Elizabeth Warren, but Seth Rogen's a biggie for Bernie. And it was a biggie propelling Yang. I mean, Joe, excuse me. See what I know? Seth Rogen's the comic,
Seth Rogen
right?
might also
Seth
be
Rogen
supporting
probably
Bernie.
also supports Bernie.
And I had your comments where Pat Kane said, I love this dynamic duo, whatever they cover. Those aren't the exact words because on my screen, and you're listening to WNHH-FM, Dateline's New Haven, 103.5 F, live stream at newhaven.org. We're talking to New Haven and Hamden reporters who are in or have been up in New Hampshire to talk about the presidential race the day before the big primary. And one of them is Sam Gerwit, New Haven Independent reporter, is on his third trip to New Hampshire. Sam, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's very nice to have you, Sam. It doesn't sound like we work together, but your face on our screen is not moving. You're managing to say a lot of words without moving your lips. Congratulations. Okay, so Sam.
I'm very, very good at playing a statue.
So Sam Gerwit, last time you reported on the ground with New Haveners and Hamden people who were working for Joe Biden, for Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. Today, you're following the big events because you're up for the Independent, covering the big candidates in New Hampshire as they're running for president. So this morning, you hitting Biden or you hitting Bernie?
This morning, I hit the third.
Or are you going to hit Elizabeth Warren maybe, or Klobuchar is pretty hot?
I decided that I needed to go even bigger and start with Michael Bennet.
Michael who? Wait. Who is this? This guy, is he a reporter?
Well, he was the superintendent of the Denver public school system, as I learned today.
Is he? What's he? Why are you hanging out with this guy?
Well, he is running for president.
He's running for president, like Democratic presidential nominee. Oh, that's right. I forgot. He was on a debate 40 years ago, right, when this campaign started. So he's still running. He's in New Hampshire.
He is indeed. He was just in New London, New Hampshire, at the Blue Loon Bakery.
Were you there too?
I was there too. He tried one of the ham and cheddar pastries, and apparently it's very good. Bacon and cheddar. And he spoke to a crowd of about, I'd say, 40 or 50 people. It was standing room only. And
well, what you do as a candidate is if you're going nowhere, you got to pick the smallest place, right? So then it looks crowded. Yeah.
Well, from what I've heard, he turned out, I think, surprisingly good crowds all over New Hampshire. He said this was his 90th event in the state, and that he's done more events here than any other candidate.
And he's is he closer to 0% or 0.5% in the polls? Do you know?
I think he's on the closer to the zero end of things.
Okay, I'm going to be honest with you, Sam. When I watched him in debates, I thought he was terrific. I thought there were all sorts of people on that ticket who I didn't agree with necessarily, like Bennett Slope to the right of me, who seemed like really responsible, thoughtful, public-spirited people. What is he sounding like today? What's his point when he's running? What is he saying is the relevance of his campaign? And in your estimation, how did he pull it off?
I too was actually very impressed by him. A lot of people say, I think a lot of the more moderate candidates in the campaign say that they have the ability to appeal to purple states, and they have the ability to bring in voters who may have voted for Trump in 2016. And if people gave him the sense I got from the room this morning was that if people outside of that room gave Michael Bennett the attention that they give other candidates who say this, I think he makes a pretty convincing case. He doesn't do a lot of bashing of other candidates. He mostly talked about the brokenness of the system. He talked about how Donald Trump is more. He's not the problem himself. He's a symptom of the problem, and that he, having been a senator in a state that is purple, Colorado, of course, trending much bluer now, that he's had those conversations with Republicans. He also, and then there was one former Republican in the crowd who thanked him and said, you are the alternative that a lot of us are looking for who can't vote for candidates further to the left. But
so, Sam, Lucy brought up something this morning that I hadn't really thought about and I hadn't known, which is that over 40% of New Hampshire's voters are independent and they get to vote in the primary. So, we've all been talking for a year about how people are going to vote, how moderates vote, how Midwest votes, how the coast, but no one had cast a vote. And then in Iowa, we found out, which was the one thing I predicted in confidence, saying that nobody ever votes for Joe Biden when it comes to actually vote. I think we're going to kind of see that about Amy, too, in terms of outside their state. But do you think that would you agree that then tomorrow we're going to find out whether Bennett and Klobuchar are correct, that there's a potential to bring in purple voters who lost to Trump last time? Is that what you think is at stake here based on what you're seeing? Testing this proposition?
I think that's what Michael Bennett would argue is at stake. And whether or not that will actually happen, I think I think there's a case to be made just based on the voters that I talked to in the room today. A lot of them I don't think have made up their minds yet.
Yeah, we've heard that.
A lot of them flip-flop a lot. It's the day before election. I was talking to one woman who's still deciding between 4 candidates, one of them being Bennett.
Mm-hmm.
And people always, you always read that New Hampshire is has been known to vote out surprises. So I think it's possible. Then again, I was in a room with about 40 people at 9 a.m. in New London. So,
and you'll be in other rooms today, Sam Gerwit. You also have been in New Hampshire a couple times. Today and in your other visits, what seems to be on people's mind? Is it healthcare? Is it climate change? Is it taxing the rich? What seemed to be, and the global economy's changes and automation, what seems to be the issue on people's minds?
I would say healthcare is the issue that comes up the most.
Because it's funny, the polling was saying otherwise. But you're hearing that. What were you heering, Tom and Lucy?
Yeah.
Healthcare is the issue that people at the doors bring up the most. It's the issue that it was really the main policy-related question that was brought up by the audience today.
Interesting.
And I think that may be, and when I ask voters about who they're supporting, they invariably mention healthcare. I think because it's one of the main areas where they see the candidates trying to differentiate themselves.
Gotcha.
So this is something that Lucy and I think heard quite a bit of a different opinion expressed in the few voters that we spoke to, but also the kind of rooms that we gauged during our weekend in New Hampshire, and that the number one issue we heard time and time and time again was beating Donald Trump. Healthcare came up, schools came up, and this is a trajectory that I think the New York Times has tried to plot in its explanations of why Warren's kind of ideologically driven campaign has lagged, and Klobuchar's kind of very moderate bipartisan pitching herself as a candidate who can bring together.
But Warren's way ahead of Klobuchar.
But I think in terms of the momentum of the campaigns right now, you see, I mean, Warren is certainly lagging, and I'd love to talk about why Sanders and Buttigieg seem to continue to be surging.
That Warren's lagging because Bernie picked up so much speed at her expense.
Well, I think that Bernie taps into a demographic that is truly unique of any candidate in this incredibly diverse field. Bernie appeals to, and we were staying at an Airbnb where another one of the guests was a 21-year-old staffer for the Bernie Sanders campaign, straight out of college, and seemed to exemplify everything about
the young man who was here too. This seems to be the idealism.
And it wasn't necessarily that she wanted to or even seemed to be able to go into the real nitty-gritty on what made Bernie Sanders' healthcare policy different than Warren's or anyone else. However, the passion that she had for this our revolution message, here's a democratic socialist who's been consistent on his values for 40 years or longer, and has been bringing together an incredibly ethnically, racially, economically diverse group of people to his rallies and to his campaigns. That is what motivates her. And what I hear, and we also had the privilege of seeing Michael Bennett speak at this candidate forum, and he was fine, but he really defined himself, at least in this forum that was sponsored by a lot of pro-choice groups, he defined himself as not a socialist. That was kind of the most important thing that he was pushing. And I think that he's a person of, integrity and great public service. And he mentioned how he's a superintendent of an urban school district, but he was really trying to say, I'm not a socialist, vote for me.
What do people mean by socialist?
I think that he was referring to Medicare for all in particular, and getting rid of private health insurance.
So he would consider Western Europe socialist?
I mean, I think so, and I think Amy Klobuchar, while not, she's offering a similar message, but she focused instead on her, working class roots and middle class values in grandfather being an iron ore miner and mother being a school teacher. I think that she was able, much more successfully than Bennett, ground her opposition to what she sees as a radical left by talking about her personal connection to a set of values that I think many more Democrats, as evidenced by Bernie Sanders' campaign, buy into. But
I mean, I think it's funny that you bring that up, because one thing that Tom and I have talked about, and Sam, I would love for you to jump in here, is that I have a real problem with the fact that both the mainstream media, and I acknowledge that we're part of the media, and several of the candidates have framed the idea of Medicare for all as a quote unquote radical opinion or radical policy, when in fact we've seen that socialized medicine in countries works. The only difference is there aren't big insurance giants that stand to lose a lot of ground and a lot of money from it. And so yesterday, I actually found it very funny because Amy Klobuchar went on this whole long tangent about how she had been to Iceland, and wasn't it amazing that in Iceland they can harness different sources of power to have better cell reception than New Hampshire? When in fact, and then she sort of took a big dump on Bernie's healthcare plan, for lack of a better word, when in fact, I could just as easily say, well, I've been to countries that have socialized healthcare, and they do much better work for their people. Like, they take better care of their people.
They have better outcomes to spend less.
Yeah, that was fun. And Iceland's an interesting example because they have a public and private sort of merger that's weird. But
which is what she supports.
Right.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
she was talking about supporting a nonprofit public option. But one last thing I want to throw in is that I think there's a reason why this Bernie campaign staffer, the very first pin she handed us, didn't say Medicare for all on it. It said Bernie beats Trump. I know that's only one small bit of evidence, but I think it's telling us to what candidates of all stripes are trying to push.
I know it's the way I feel. So, Sam, are you still there?
Yeah.
So, Sam, I take it now, since you're our person today and tomorrow in New Hampshire, and thank you so much for being up there for us. You've been doing a great job. So, are you next hitting the big Warren rally, or are you now hitting the big Buttigieg rally, because that one's hot?
I am now on my way to Andrew Yang.
Andrew who?
Concord. Andrew Yang.
Yang. Oh, he's running too, right? He's the guy who wants to give everybody money.
Indeed, he is running.
But then I take it you're going to close the day with the big Klobuchar crowd excitement or the Bernie Sanders rally, right?
Nope, I'm going for the top polling Deval Patrick.
Devil, you said?
Deval Patrick.
Oh, Deval Patrick. Right. He's running for president too?
Yes, indeed. He's still doing it.
Well, you know what, Sam?
We'll see.
You've piqued my interest. What I'm going to make sure to do after I edit your article is read it. I think we can all follow. Sam Gerwitt is going to let us know before the polling takes place who are these long shots taking their last stand in New Hampshire. Sam, thanks so much for calling in. Good luck at the Yang rally. Looking forward to what you have to write, and stay safe up there, okay? Watch out for the poutine.
Bye, Sam.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye. Thank you.
That was Sam Gerwitt up in New Hampshire for the New Haven Independent, and we're in the WNHH studio for Dateline New Haven with two other local reporters, New Haven Arts, New Haven Independent, Tom Breen and Lucy Gelman, who were in New Hampshire this weekend, and were in all sorts of places in 2016 here and abroad within the states of the presidential campaign. So anything besides technology, is anything looking the same or different from 2016 to you two so far?
Well, I want to just briefly talk about Andrew Yang, who is, like Klobuchar, not my gospel. However, Andrew Yang is having so much fun. He is the only candidate, I think, at this point who's having fun, who's not exhausted and just completely.
He's inspiring people. Next to Bernie, I would say he's inspiring the most people.
He is having so much fun. He was making jokes left and right about how Iowa had messed up. He said, what did he say, Tom? He said, New Hampshire, you know what? I'm going to get your vote, and then they're going to know on Tuesday night. He was like, boom, boom, boom. After the debate on Friday, he was the one who was joking and laughing and
literally jumping up and down. He may have, jumped.
And when you look at who supports him, as with Sanders, his support goes from right all the way to left.
Yes.
But he is trying, in addition to having fun, he's trying to reframe the debate. He's saying that automation, technological change is the biggest issue that underlies the other stuff we're worried about declining standard of living in the working class, income inequality, and the future of employment. And he believes that underlies, and I would agree that isn't the full picture, but he would say that's the biggest reason underlies Trumpism and what you have to present an alternative to. Do you think, in addition to having fun, do you see him succeeding beyond his Joe Rogan listeners who went to the campaign?
So I did. This didn't make it into my Klobuchar article because it was a little too far afield. But at this Shea Vashon diner, I did talk to an Andrew Yang voter who's wearing a Yang 2020 beanie. He grew up in Alaska, then moved to California, and then flew out from California to New Hampshire to campaign for Yang. And he said it was all. I think that on the one hand there is the explanations that Yang offers for how technology is influencing the economy today and the future. And then there's the solution he proposed, which I think has resonated much, much more strongly, in a way that any explanation that requires a little thought can sometimes be a bit difficult to take hold. He's offering $1,000 a month as in universal basic income or freedom dividends to everyone. And that's what, this person told me. He said in Alaska, he is, one of the few Americans familiar with universal basic income because Alaska does, hand out subsidies to its residents on a monthly basis. So he's talking about how he saw that, his parents got something like a couple $100s a month for every kid they had. in Alaska, and he said that he really, saw, besides being able to buy like an extra Lego set or something, he was like, really helped my parents, pay for our education, pay for the basic bills, and he thinks it's a phenomenally effective, again, there's just one voter, he said a phenomenally effective way to make sure that, people of every single, wake of life are not cash poor on a constant basis. And I think that is, part of what has propelled Yang so far, in that he is a single issue candidate maybe a predominantly single issue candidate from my perception. And it's one that people find incredibly novel here in America and incredibly appealing.
He is, although when he got on, at the Our Rights, Our Courts forum, I kind of thought, okay, he's going to do his wackadoodle thing and maybe make some good points and it's going to be interesting. But he actually had really interesting ideas about the restructuring of the courts, and also said maybe one of my favorite things, which was it was either unintended or intended to be a laugh line, but which is when a woman is making a choice, the men should just get the hell out of the room. And I thought that was great. I mean, he's great. He's charismatic. I don't think he's going to do super well.
I'd love to see him in the cabinet. Bob McCormick says, how about Bloomberg?
So I think, an article, maybe the article I had the most fun writing that we'll publish on The Independent later today, was about Tom Steyer, as
the mini
people
billionaire
on the far
race.
Left derisively call a single-digit billionaire, as opposed to, he's worth, Forbes estimates around $1.6 billion.
I thought it was 1.7. No?
Michael, you may be a point ahead of me, and Michael Bloomberg is estimated around, worth around $62 billion. So their wealth is just incredibly different. However, Steyer, in this interview about the courts, he was really pushing these nuanced, detailed differences between Democrats. Doesn't matter. We should be telling the electorate over and over again, pick someone who has a good chance against Trump, because we need to win and we need to beat
Patricia Kane said, is Tulsi Gabbard on anyone's radar?
Ooh, I'll get to
we
Tulsi in a second
too.
But I did want to say that this article I wrote about Steyer, where an MSNBC journalist asked him, is what you do with your money any different in terms of the health for democracy than what the Koch brothers do with their money? Obviously, they're funding incredibly different causes, but do we want a Democratic candidate who one can kind of buy his way into an election, and who too fundamentally believes that there is a role for billionaires to sway the general electorate through their money? Now, Tom Steyer is maybe most famous politically for founding Next Gen America, like a legit grassroots, organizing campaign.
After legit making his money on the coal industry.
Right. Mm-hmm. He was a hedge fund, made Yale a whole bunch of money too. But, he's a hedge fund person who's now has, apologized for all of those investments and has made climate emergency a big part of his campaign. But I think that, the role that he sees big money playing hints at, Bloomberg is kind of casting this shadow, at least for me, over the entire campaign right now, and that he's likely, if Biden completely plummets, he's likely to emerge as the moderate standard bearer come Super Tuesday, or maybe even a contested convention. And I think what Steyer was getting at about how he sees a role for big money in Democratic politics is kind of what we're seeing with Bloomberg,
right?
Not in New Hampshire, but
Bloomberg's
nationally.
big money is going to be about attacking Trump in Trump ways.
Right.
That's
I know you've loved a few, but can you talk about our Tulsi Gabbard exposure?
Oh yeah, Tulsi was MIA, but her signs were not. So the majority of signs that we saw were Tulsi signs, like
hands
Tulsi
down
billboards, big Tulsi signs. But Tulsi was nowhere to be found, and this actually came up in an interview that I did. So yesterday, Tom and I spent just 2 hours in the morning in a diner, the Red Arrow Diner, which is frequently a campaign stop for folks. And I talked to this couple who had driven to New Hampshire from White Plains, New York. And the husband was, both retired educators, and the husband was really interested in seeing Tulsi. He's like completely open. He can see going for Trump again. But so I think
what were their names?
So it's in the article I'm running
right,
later
a White
today.
Plains native.
I grew up in White Plains. I was wondering for New
Any
Hampshire.
Tulsi fans,
He is open to Trump, but he's also open to like Sanders and Warren, and he's really Tulsi curious. The problem is Tulsi wasn't showing up anywhere.
Right.
So she had this really robust
Where was
visual
Tulsi?
presence. I don't know.
She meeting with Assad again? Or what?
If anyone knows where Tulsi was,
do you think her
signs
signs were paid for by Putin or by Richard Spencer, who helped her get in the debates?
She was the only candidate we saw with a billboard. Usually you see signs everywhere, and that's one of the
Now, why do you think there
most
weren't
fun
billboards?
parts.
Why do you think there weren't billboards?
I don't know. There's something about New Hampshire primary campaign culture. It's just
A lot
lawn
of
signs
signs.
are such an important part of it. And I think that every highway median or every suburban tract you drive through, there are invariably so many signs. And with so many candidates running, it's it's really fun to see. I would say the most signs we saw at Tulsi Gabbard, the biggest signs in terms of actual size, definitely Andrew Yang. he was buying billboard-sized lawn signs.
All right, we're talking about New Hampshire here on Dateline New Haven, 103.5 FM, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. Lucy Gelman and Tom Breen, reporters, back with eyewitness accounts from New Hampshire. So, Lucy, I remember one of your stories from 2016. You were at some event where there were Sanders people and Hillary Clinton people.
Yes.
And there was hatred.
I don't know if I remember this story, but okay.
And the way you came back to talk about the people were just hating each other. They saw each other's side as the devil, that that it was just evil. They had a crush in that other side. Is that the same dynamic this time? Because I want to challenge something here, okay? Now, I'm someone who has personal views that very much align with Sanders and Warren. I'm completely for single-payer health care, for instance, right? So, and the Green New Deal. I don't know how relevant this is all to the discussion this time, and I'm wondering if that hate is going to break down. For instance, on healthcare, it took pulling teeth to get a Republican version of healthcare known as Romney Care that became Obamacare passed. They're all fighting, which I think is an important fight about the debating societies at Oxford. Should we go to single-payer healthcare, which I believe in, or should we go to Medicare for people who want it, since a lot of people have other plans they want, and then gradually the public option will bring them in. Truth is, to get even 1/10 of that is going to be war. Okay, so so let me read you something David Leonard wrote in the New York Times today. Okay, and to see what you think, how this plays into what you saw in 2016 and whether we're going to see it again. Leonard says, yes, the candidates have their differences, but they have much bigger similarities. If elected, every single Democratic presidential candidate would act to slow climate change, raise taxes on the rich, reduce gun deaths, expand voting rights, lower health care and education costs, include more people in health care, protect abortion access, enforce civil rights laws, appoint progressive judges, rebuild overseas alliances, and stop treating the Justice Department as a personal enforcer. The candidates are all running to the left of Barack Obama, and they've been constrained by Congress. And every one of those positions is diametrically opposed to Donald Trump. So he's saying that in the long run, each side is likely to accomplish much more if it can recognize that the other isn't the enemy. That when they're arguing about the fine points that matter at Oxford and at the New Haven Independent and New Haven Arts, we care about these issues about how policy should be done. That what's really at the stake at the ground is such a dramatic, fundamental difference between every single Democrat and Donald Trump. Is there a risk that we're going to see a replay of what you saw in 2016, or the demonizing and of the other side?
So I actually heard a lot less nastiness, both from the candidates and from folks that we talked to. We were there for a shorter period of time, so that may have been part of it. I heard a couple people who I talked to, especially yesterday, both at the Amy Klobuchar rally and just in this diner, say, Bernie's too far to the left for me. But they didn't say we think he's crazy. One person who voted for Trump 4 years ago and is voting for Trump again said, I think he's a cuckoo. And I think Amy is very nice. That was sort of as far as he would go. But I haven't seen it. If anything, I think in the media, in her interviews, sort of every time she is given the mic, Hillary Clinton is the one who's still trying to sow these seeds of nastiness about Bernie Sanders. And I think it's really dangerous.
Do you think the Democrats
will
be able to unite? Because I'm never with these people who fret every time there are arguments in primaries, because primaries toughen you up for the general.
Yeah.
No matter how much Democrats throw mud at each other, they're going to get a lot more at the $1 billion from Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But there were lasting scars last time.
Yes.
From that kind of personal hatred. Do you think that people, from what you can see from voters, will they unite behind a Democratic candidate in what is going to be an uphill fight?
So my hope is yes, that they will. And I will say the kind of two things that came from Klobuchar over the weekend. So one was she basically called Pete a baby on Friday night, and he's young, he's 38, but he does have lived experience, which some of his
and he got almost as many votes as Justin Elker did when he won an election. Just not quite as many.
I know, he still gets an allowance from his parents. Yeah. But then yesterday, I think Amy Klobuchar said something to the tone of flailing about and screaming on stage, and she was very directly talking about Bernie Sanders. She didn't have to say the word Bernie Sanders for people to know that she was talking about Bernie Sanders. But But I am hopeful that there will be a more united front, and that whoever the and I agree with Tom that we might have a really interesting convention. Thank you, a contested convention. But I'm very hopeful that people will just get behind a candidate. And so far, I haven't seen the same divisiveness. But it's early yet.
What do you see in the Bernie Sanders campaign? How is the operation same or different? You talked about the incredible idealism, which is there. We had Ryan Doherty on here. It's exactly what you guys experienced. There's really a youth, and I think it is both issue focused. There's a fundamental change through Green New Deal and Medicare for All, but also, and I think this is where Bernie just intellectually wins the argument, which is that the only way you're going to enact this stuff is to continue organizing. You're not going to get any kind of Medicare change, any kind of healthcare change from Mitch McConnell through negotiation is by bringing people to Kentucky to demonstrate. What do you see same? What do you see different about Bernie's campaign this time?
So I definitely want to hear about differences that Lucy experienced from covering the New Haven Bernie rally versus what we saw in 2020. But I do think that Bernie, when we saw Bernie speak in this candidate forum about the courts, he promised that he will, if elected president, he will not just be the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. He will be the organizer-in-chief of the progressive movement of American politics. And he said even once elected president, he will travel kind of constantly all over the country to put pressure on Democratic politicians and Republican politicians alike to get behind what he sees as positions that are backed by a majority of Americans.
He is 4 years and 1 heart attack older than he was last time.
Right,
that's true.
But I do
worries me a lot.
But I do, yeah. I mean, I do think that Lucy wrote this really, I think, fantastic and really gets at the core appeal of Bernie Sanders. An article where she kind of structured it like a news from the pews, kind of writing about a preacher at the pulpit. But it was Bernie Sanders offering this 3-minute kind of eloquent disquisition on how he believes that regardless of, what people look like or where they come from or really whether or not they're American, I mean, we all share these same goals and beliefs of having, access to good education where you don't go terribly into debt, you have high quality health care, that also you don't go into terrible debt for, you have a good paying job. I mean, he really has this, this moral message that I think was there in 2016. I think that he is structuring it a bit more strategically this time and saying that this is one that will beat Trump as opposed to this one that is just ideologically superior. And I think that those two, kind of marrying those two impulses, has been incredibly successful. However, I didn't hear from, one person that we spoke to that they would not vote for a certain candidate if that person was elected. There is not the same binary, as Sanders-Clinton as we saw in 2016 in our experience in New Hampshire. People were undecided between 4, or they were saying, we think they're all great. However, we think Klobuchar actually has a better chance than self-identified socialists. So that's why I'm going for her. We really did not hear anything bad spoken by Democrats about other candidates. Last point, I have no confidence whatsoever, though, that the Democratic Party will be able to unite around a candidate, because I think that the party establishment is still absolute anathema to them to have Bernie Sanders.
Well, they're rigging it again.
And so the convention, I think, is going to be a mess if there's still 4 or 5 candidates in the
I think it's a hot mess. One thing that we didn't see firsthand, but we did hear about from the Bernie staffer who was staying in the same house where we were staying, was that there is still a good number of people in New Hampshire and maybe around the country who say either I'm going to vote for Trump or I'm going to vote for Bernie, because they see both of them as outsider candidates. So that was one thing. But also on the Bernie point, I think that the greatest service that Bernie did the country 4 years ago was moving the discussion far to the left, like much farther to the left than certainly Hillary was going to take it, than any other candidate was going to take it. And now some of those ideas, actually a number of those ideas, are seen as more in the mainstream. Definitely. So I think Medicare for All, even though some candidates are saying this is a wacky idea, this is way too far to the left, this is a radical idea, we just need to do reform on the Affordable Care Act, you're seeing a lot more people, or at least we talk to a lot more people who actually don't think, oh, that's crazy, that's so far out of left field.
Alex Brennan's giving me a double high five. So I found Lucy's article.
That's my brother-in-law, by the way.
Hi, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
So Lucy had a point in her that I found really interesting that made me think anew about Bernie Sanders. In her article about, you were at the event, and it was kind of the wonky form. You described it earlier. It's about justice and about Supreme Court rules. and that Bernie Sanders, the atheist, the self-proclaimed atheist who would be the first Jewish president, so religion is like all over this freaking thing in the background. Jew, atheist, either of those things you can run, although some people think all Jews are communist atheists. But anyway, so Bernie Sanders not only was there in the room as the person to be the first Jew and is open about being an atheist, but he does give the most small r religious politicking, the most message that, and you know, what you were talking about in your article that I took from it was he talks about values in a way that you were tying to the Poor People's Campaign, which comes out of the Black church. That when he's talking about the morality of who we are as human beings, as a society, and seeking justice and how that fits into everything from college debt to healthcare to climate change, that he actually is making a religious pitch to values that politics is supposed to tie into, but so often doesn't. Is that what you saw? Is that what you're getting at with that article? Is that what you felt when you saw him versus and why he connects?
Yeah, I was really moved by it. I mean, I think he also connects on a policy viewpoint, and like he, of all of the candidates, and I think this is one of the reasons he is doing much better than Elizabeth Warren right now. He is an excellent rhetorician. When I listened to Bernie Sanders, I was like, yes, preach, Bernie, amen.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Yeah, but I am like, Bernie is not my ride or die in this election, right?
Yeah.
And so, but he, I actually would say big R religious. I would push back a little.
Well,
on
I meant
that
he's not. He's with a former established religion.
Correct.
He's against
Correct.
former big R
He,
religion.
So he tied the Bible, and
It's
this
like
is
democratic with small d to capital D.
correct. Correct. So this is the Poor People's Campaign is this revived campaign led by the Reverend William Barber II, and Bernie has talked to William Barber. He's been on like an interview podcast format. There's a video actually if you go to the Sanders website, and he talked about the Bible as a document of justice, and this is actually something that like religious leaders either seize on or they don't, and there's a big gray area that we don't have time to.
And how does one
into
define
here.
justice? But tzedek tirdof, justice you pursue
Right.
is like one of
But
our
he
favorite.
also, I mean, he also is a candidate, and this is talking about him moving the dialogue left. He is ready to talk about racial justice in a way that I think a lot of the candidates are not. So Amy Klobuchar is ready to talk about climate justice. I don't know if she's ready to talk about environmental racism and things like that. But Bernie is ready to really talk about reparations. He's ready to talk about the legacy of slavery that is still very much alive in the country today. And all of those go back to a very specific interpretation of the Bible.
And that is different from 4 years ago. Bernie saw everything in economic terms, which I still think he mostly does. But where he was schooled last time is that racism is coming out of an economic system, but it also in and of itself drives decisions separate from economics. And that's something that made him have a hard time connecting with black voters last time that he appears to be doing better on this time.
Part of what makes New Hampshire so intoxicatingly fun for people who care about politics is that New Hampshire, you know, in the way that the state sport of Indiana is basketball, New Hampshire says the state sport of New Hampshire is politics. And that's how it kind of feels. You know, we go up to think and hear people talk about the issues, but also political strategy is like the kind of the most important, you know, one of the most important things we see, you know, candidates trying to perfect. And I think that what Sanders is able to do right now is that he's able to leverage a moral message that's both an economic one and a deeply personal one, and then talk about how Trump's politics is amoral at both an individual level. Obviously, this man like has lived a life of kind of unbridled hedonism and exploitation of the weak, but also politically, this is an amoral politics that Trump, practices. In one, again, that you know, points fingers at the needy and the marginalized and lifts up the super rich. I did want to sneak in one of my favorite things about this trip as we near the end of the hour. Well, besides being able to report with Lucy, who both professional partner and personal partner, is just awesome to be able to do that.
Gets you through the gate.
Oh, it really is such a treat.
Yeah.
Second thing, free parking on weekends in Manchester was kind of great. Not to have to pay for parking. I wouldn't advocate for it.
But they could have made money if they had.
They totally could have, and yet it was nice not to have to worry about parking.
Make that much money on the primary.
So this, and then the third thing was that New Hampshire Public Radio has published a podcast series called Stranglehold this year. There are 14 episodes out so far, and it's all about the first in the nation primary
Was that the woman they wrote about
industrial
in the
complex.
Times today, whose everyone is wanting to beat up because she's from New
Exactly.
Hampshire.
People are
Exactly.
really angry
So
at
she
her.
is really, it's an
Well,
investigative reporter.
What do you think about New Hampshire having the first? Now, Tom did have a picture of an African American voter.
He did.
Was
and
this the only one?
He was from Brooklyn originally. He just moved to Manchester a couple years ago.
No, there were.
But he's a Manchester voter. He's a
Actually,
Manchester
at the Klobuchar rally, I found like the two people of color in the room. One of them didn't want to talk because he was a college student, and he was like, "I'm not ready to talk about my political views." But the other one was like, he was really excited to talk. He actually holds 3 degrees from Yale, and so he was like, "Oh my gosh, I want to talk to you about New Haven," which was really wonderful. But one thing
What did he say?
He said that he is disappointed that New Haven has not changed that much since he was here. But he also said,
when was he here?
Yeah.
But so he was here like 20 years ago.
Oh my God! I just had a friend came here from 20 years ago. He said I was in a completely different city.
But
New Haven did not look anything like this 20 years ago.
He really believes
he got
that
3 degrees
Klobuchar-
at Yale.
He did. Yeah.
And he couldn't see that New Haven looks completely different.
But he
like a dubious
talked
source.
about how Klobuchar, and this is something that we probably don't have time to talk about. The word honesty came up a lot when I talked to people about Klobuchar, which was very interesting. But one thing that I wanted to say about New Hampshire and Bernie, and the fact that I hope that he continues to talk about sort of this idea of like the gospel of Bernie Sanders and whether he's going to involve this family, this sort of family values, and is there a new family values argument somewhere in there, is New Hampshire is an assault in caucasity. It is so white. It is so white. And I think in that way, it does not look like this very vibrant country that we have.
Yeah, and I think that's again what this podcast I think does really well in that it says one of the primary responsibilities of investigative journalism is to interrogate entrenched institutions of power. And in New Hampshire, they see the primary, which has been the first in the nation primary for a long time, as something that skews national politics.
No question. I mean, if we're not for New Hampshire, we would never have had President Patrick Buchanan.
Right.
Oh, sorry. Oops,
right. I mean, and Sanders won the primary in 2016 by something like 20 points, and he'll probably win. Again, not to say that the candidates
that is
come
the
out,
final question. Bob McCormick said, "Who's going to win?"
Oh, see,
baseball time. Folks.
I told myself that I wouldn't just
you
guess.
Don't have to.
I mean, I think Sanders will definitely win the New Hampshire primary.
I think I talked to a lot of people who
Doesn't mean he'll be the nominee,
were into Buttigieg.
So who I think is going to win the New Hampshire primary? Meaning who, after the New Hampshire primary, is going to be in a much stronger position they were on Wednesday than they were on Monday?
Listeners?
Mike Bloomberg.
Oh, Mike Bloomberg.
Ooh,
yeah.
But that's for Wednesday's show.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, listen, feel very grateful that Lucy Gilman, Tom Breen, and Sam Gerwood have been in New Hampshire, bringing some New Haven eyes to the New Hampshire primary. Great insights. Made me think anew. You guys both made me think anew about this election. And thanks to the miracle man behind the control, WNHA station manager Harry Droz, who managed to put only 2 outraged tweets rather than 45, which is the number he had last week. When there was someone for Joe Biden. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.